Well, hello everybody. Welcome to Schmidt Greenhouses. My name's Kurt,
And I'm Holly.
and we run Schmidt Greenhouses here in Dryden. And so we wanted to put together a video series this spring with the situation that we are in these days. A lot of people are starting to try to grow their own food and grow their own seeds. So we thought we'd put this series together to help people get a little bit of a head start and get some questions answered about how to start seeds. So whether you're a veteran or whether you're a brand new person, you'll probably get a few tips out of what we're going to be doing over the weeks ahead. So this video series is entitled You Can Grow. And today we're going to start with our first installment, which is called The Right Stuff. And so we're going to look at what do you need to be able to be a successful gardener. Right? And just like anything else, if you have the right tools, that certainly helps to be much more successful. So Holly and I are going to show you a number of different things to think about as you start growing. So around here we have a growing season of about 100 days, which is challenging, and so most people will try to start a number of seeds inside ahead of time. And so that's really what we're looking at today, is to how to get started, getting those seeds growing, getting them germinated, and getting some success inside. And then later on we'll talk about transplanting outside and some of the other parts. Okay, so other things that are going to be in the series certainly are things like pests and diseases. We'll be talking about different types of vegetable and fruit production, and just a whole bunch of different things that you're going to come up with. And so you're going to come up with lots of questions. We're quite sure of that. We get phone calls fairly regularly, and we get questions on Facebook and the website, and that's fantastic. And so to address that a little bit more, we've created something also on our website called Ask the Expert. So if you go onto our website, which is
SchmidtGreenhouses.com.
If you go on there, you will find on the right side it says Ask the Expert. If you click on there, you will be able to access our Ask the Expert forum. And so a number of us in the greenhouse will do our best to answer your questions. And there's a few different topics, such as trees and shrubs, and pests and diseases, and vegetable gardening, and just some general questions. So please take advantage of that and use that as another opportunity to get some of your gardening questions answered. Okay, so we're going to hop in today to the right stuff. And the first thing we're going to talk about is containers. In the greenhouse, we have all sorts of specialized containers that we grow in. A whole bunch of recyclable plastics and whatnot that we use, but that's probably for the most part more than anybody really needs to use in their home. And really nowadays they're difficult to access. Okay, so if you're just trying to start a few seeds on your own, probably you've got what you need around the house. So just a couple things to think about. Certainly things like a margarine container, or yogurt containers, or milk containers that you can cut, pop bottles that you can cut open. Okay, they're all things that are great opportunities for you to just create a whole bunch of little holders. Egg cartons are another great option. Okay, you've got, firstly on the one side, you've got the individual little ones that you can cut individually into little chunks, or you could do the other side where you just fill it and you have an open row. Okay, so either of those is a great option. Toilet paper, I know it's a hot commodity these days, but if you've got toilet paper rolls, not a bad option. You can cut them in half, you can put a bottom on them or not, and set them into a container, whether it's your margarine tub or whatever the case may be, and you can fill those with soil. And again, they're going to compost a little later when you eventually plant them outdoors. Another one that you might have seen on the web, if you browse around a little bit, is just newspaper. Okay, so what you can do is you can take a pill container or something like that, whatever is an appropriate size. You're going to take a little piece of newspaper and you're just going to start rolling it around. Roll it up. You can fold the bottom in a little bit as you go. Okay, and in the end you end up with a nice little cup like this. And you can place a whole bunch of those. You could place probably half a dozen into a margarine container. Again, the size depends on what you want to use for a pill container, or whatever you roll around. Okay, so again, those are nice and biodegradable. You can plant those right into the garden, and you don't have to worry about pots or anything like that. Okay, so just a few tricks and tips to think about as you consider what to plant into. All right, Holly and I are not coffee drinkers, which is surprising for somebody who works long hours, but if you are a coffee drinker, chances are you may have a coffee machine that has K-cups or something similar to that. And so that might be another thing to take a look at. Those disposable cups would probably make some pretty good little seed starter containers. So be creative, give it some thought of what you have around the house, and work from there. All right, and I'm going to pass it over to Holly now, and she's going to chat a little bit about soils.
So soils is a bit of a broad term. What we use, everything that we grow in the greenhouse is actually in a soil-less mix. So it's all peat-based. And the biggest reason for that is that peat moss is sterile. It's not going to be full of weeds or full of disease. And so it's just going to lend you that much more success in your gardening. For seed starting, we've got an example of a really fine starter mix here. Again, straight peat. And it's very, very fine. You can see what I'm playing with here in my hands is just almost a dust, and it's just nice and light, and your seeds won't get overly buried in there, and they'll just have the most success at growing. So what I've got in this tray is a bit of a heavier mix, and it has some perlite and vermiculite in there. And you can do some of your larger seeds in that, like a cucumber seed or corn seed or something that's not going to just get lost in that airier mix. But again, for seed starting, this is your mix of choice for sure, something that's just very fine and light, and it's something that's easily watered. It's not going to absorb too much moisture, and Kurt's going to talk about water in just a little bit.
Yeah, so when you're looking for soils, look for a seed starter mix or starter mix, as compared to a topsoil or a potting soil. Those are usually the more coarse mixes.
Right. Good.
All right. So Holly mentioned vermiculite and perlite. Okay, so here's just an example of a seed starter mix. Right? So very, very similar to what we've got here. But when you are buying soils, a lot of them will have vermiculite. Okay, vermiculite is an expanded mica. It's just it's something that helps to control moisture and helps to aerate the soil a little bit. Works great in larger plants, not good in a starter mix. Okay, especially if it's coarse. You might be able to see here, but it's quite coarse. They're kind of like the size of a little pellet. Okay, so good for later on, not really great for a starter mix for what we're talking about now. The other thing that you will find, and as Holly pointed out, there's a lot of little white, that is perlite. Okay, and that again is a good soil aerator. It's fantastic for later on when we've got larger plants that are looking to develop healthy roots. But again, the problem right now is if we get too much air, those seeds, when they germinate, are going to dry out and die. Okay, so we want a fairly thick or not an awful lot of air mass in that soil, and so that's why we're using this really fine peat mix. Okay. Also, one nice thing about the peat moss is it has a good pH. So we'll talk later on about pH. pH is how acid or how basic the soil is, and sphagnum peat moss in itself has a slightly acid pH, which is great for growing and starting plants. Okay, just slightly below 7, and so it works very well. Later on we'll talk about things that you may need to do to adjust some pH or test the pH of your soil. But at this point, that's not really much of a concern if you've got a good starter mix. All right, so Holly's going to talk a little bit about seeds to start off here.
Yeah, we've just got a few samples of some vegetable seeds. Vegetable gardening is certainly on trend right now with the current world situation, and we're seeing a lot of new gardeners coming through wanting to grow their own vegetables, and so I mean that's really what's instigated this series, is just to give everyone the most chance of success with their new gardening, and like Kurt has already said, even a veteran still has questions, but as far as seed goes, certainly there are different sizes of seed. Some are very tiny and some are not as small. But you can get individual seed packets with the cucumber and the tomato that I've got here will just have individual seeds in them. And then these are called seed tape, and inside there is a row of seed that's already
Impregnated.
thank you. He's the teacher, I'm just the assistant. Into the like a little strip of tape that you can then either in your garden or in your seed tray, like this open tray that we've started here, you can just row that out. You can make a little row, lay your seed tape right in there, and just do a little bit of a cover to make sure that it's got a little bit of protection, and then water that in very gently. The individual seed, of course, is just what it sounds like, and then you would just either make little divots in your soil, your peat, not soil, and then just plant them in that little divot, and again, just do a tiny little covering, and then be prepared for your watering.
And it's good to make sure your peat is a little bit moist before you start putting seeds in it. So you might want to just take your peat, put a little water in it, mix it around until you get just a nice moist texture to it. You don't want it overly wet, but peat sometimes can be a little hard to get wet at first, so being moisten it before you start putting your seeds in, that certainly helps really well. All right.
I don't think we talked about just just very lightly watering. If you can access something like this in, say, a Windex bottle or something along that line. These are a little bit harder to come by, but then you can just mist it and be able to not overwater. It's a lot easier to underwater and add a little bit more than it is if you overwater and have to try to dry it out again then.
Absolutely. All right. So just a couple other things about seeds. So certainly not all seeds are great to grow indoors. Those things like carrots, those root type of vegetables, probably better to wait till outside. And the seed tapes are great even when you're going outside. Okay, some of us are very having difficulty with our dexterity, and even seeing those seeds can sometimes be very difficult when you get some very small seeds like carrots. So certainly take a look for that seed tape if you're planning on planting that. Not every seed has to be covered. So Holly said, put a little bit of covering over it. Generally, that is absolutely true. Okay, you want to be able to keep the moisture up around that plant. You want to kind of protect it a little bit. There are a few types that are not very happy to be covered. They want to have the light. Lettuce is one of those ones that actually doesn't mind. It prefers to have more light to be able to germinate. It'll still germinate if you cover it over, but you're going to probably not get as high a germination. If you're looking at growing your own flowers, things like petunias need a real fair bit of light to be able to germinate well. And if you have some particular questions, or you want to go browsing around to see, well, what ones need light and which ones need to be covered. Generally, you're pretty safe if you're going to cover them. They may be a little slower germinating. You might get a few less germinating, but covering is typically better than not covering. Alrighty. One other thing before we move away from seeds is stratifying. Some seeds are really hard to germinate, especially if you want to try some perennials or things like rosemary and some of those things that are really slow coming on. You may want to try stratifying seed. What that means is your seed needs to absorb some moisture for it to start to think, oh, it's time to start to grow. And they have a hard shell, so some of them are really hard to start absorbing that moisture. So one way to do that is to get some peat, just like this. Get it fairly wet, okay, so you don't want to be wringing out a bunch of moisture in it, but you want it fairly moist. Mix your seeds right in there, throw them in a baggie, throw them in the fridge or the freezer for a couple weeks. Okay, and what that's going to do is, preferably the fridge, it's going to allow them not to freeze solid, but it's going to allow them to start to absorb some of that moisture over that time. Okay, and then when they come out of the fridge, they're going to be a lot more ready to start to grow. Okay, so you don't want to put a lot of soil, otherwise you won't find some of those seeds, but then you can just spread it out over, cover it over, and see what you get for germination. Okay, so just a little tip if you're having really low germination or not getting any germination on some of your seed varieties. All right. We'll talk about light. You want to talk about light, or you want me to?
Oh, you go ahead.
Okay. So in terms of once you've got them planted and you've been watering a little bit, right? So you're keeping them going there like that. And what you really want to do is you want to have nice humidity. You mentioned you want to have moisture around the seed as well. Okay, so it's good if you have an open tray like this, or you have some small pots. Even covering them over early with something like saran wrap is a great option, just to keep the humidity in there. Once they've started to sprout and grow, that's not as big a deal. You can just keep misting them with something like this, but at first certainly try to keep the humidity as high as you can. Alright, so in terms of light, most windows in the house don't give you enough light to grow indoors. Okay, so what you'll end up doing is, even if they're in the window, you typically get kind of stretched plants. They're looking very pale, not terribly green. And so that's really just a matter of lack of light. So if you have some soft white fluorescent lights, or you might have a grow light, if you can add that to it, that would be great. Also, 12 to 16 hours of light would be fantastic if you can get that. And 8 hours a day is not really enough, and that's part of the reason why you might get some stretching. Okay, so just keep that in mind, just to try to get as much light on them as possible, and you're going to get a much more quality plant. All right. So, what else we got there? Certainly also just think about when you're using your soil and your water. We talked about sanitation and not having any diseases, okay, not having any weeds. So using clean water, keeping your pots all clean, that's going to make a big difference in success in terms of fighting off any disease. One of the main diseases that you're going to run into is called damping off, which very often happens in new seedlings. It's basically a bacteria that is going to get at the roots. We live next door to a trucking place, so it's not exactly the most serene environment some days. That's all right. I'll just give them a minute. There we go. Okay, so to combat damping off, are you going to be able to eliminate it? No. Okay, everybody struggles with it. There were some products that have been removed from the market that people used to use years ago, but now it's a bit more of a challenge. Okay, so some things to think about. Firstly, don't plant them too deep. You plant your seeds too deep. If it's a bigger seed, yeah, it goes a little bit deeper. If it's a small seed, keep it fairly close to the surface, and it doesn't have to work so hard to get out of the soil. Okay, and what happens often, it'll use up all its energy before it gets to the earth, level of the earth, and it struggles. Okay, things like sterilizing your pot, we said. Also the temperature of your water. Try not to water with cold water. Try to keep it room temperature, 70, 75 degrees or more, and that'll certainly help quite a bit. Another thing about, we talked about moisture, try not to get it overly wet, right? If they're sitting in moisture or really damp conditions, that's a perfect source for bacteria to build up. Okay, and the last thing is fertilizer. Okay, we'll have a whole section on fertilizers and what that's all about. For now, you don't need to use any fertilizers for the first part. Always got a couple plants here, I think. So here's a tomato plant that we've been growing. So this has been growing for a few weeks now, and we've got one with a couple. Thank you. What we've got here, this is one that's germinated. Hopefully you can see that. And you can see there's 2 leaves showing. Well, those are not actually leaves. Okay, they're not true leaves. These are called cotyledons. Okay, and so even at this point, you should not be fertilizing. What you want is, take a look at this plant. We've got our cotyledons, and then we've got some true leaves starting to form as well. Okay, if you have a pair of true leaves or 2 pairs of true leaves, then you can probably start thinking about doing some fertilizer. And again, it's only going to be at about 25% of what you might normally use for a plant. Right, so yeah, you got nice little cotyledons there. Yep, so I'm just going to show you that. So don't be in a rush to fertilize. Okay, a lot of the stuff we do here, we use clear water for quite a while, and then once they get those first couple pair of true leaves, then we can start putting some nitrogen on them and getting some nice root growth and some nice green growth. Okay, but we'll talk more about fertilizers later on. All right, I think we've kind of covered what we need to cover for today. Is there anything else that we've forgotten, Holly?
Probably. But that's
Probably,
why we're
yes.
doing a series, and we'll think about that for the next time.
Okay, so just to recap, we are going to be. Whoops! Right? Ah, I gotta love it. It's our first try. Okay, so just to recap, we are going to be doing this every week through the spring. So keep your eye on here every Friday afternoon. We're posting something. Apparently they like it too. All right, and yeah, so the series is called You Can Grow. Please take advantage of the Ask the Expert on our website. And for those of you who have come out for season bulbs, great to see you. For those of you who are concerned about the spring season, we are in the process of creating a phone order system, and we are also looking at an online store. So keep an eye on our website for more information as that comes along. Really, there won't be much for sales before Mother's Day. That's usually our typical start to the retail season. So we hope to see you in one way or another through the spring season, but certainly we hope to see you online at least. So if you have questions, certainly make sure you field those our way. All right, and I think that's it for today.
That's it.
Got a wrap?
Yep. Thanks for your
Okay.
time.
Okay. Happy gardening.